The story of Elizabeth begins in a world where joy never arrived without fear close behind. She was born into stone halls heavy with expectation, where the future of a kingdom rested on fragile shoulders long before she could understand the weight of it. The court celebrated her arrival with careful smiles, yet beneath the music and ceremony lived a quiet disappointment. England wanted a son. Elizabeth arrived instead, wrapped in silk, already learning that love in this world could be conditional, and safety could vanish without warning. Her earliest memories were shaped by distance. Her father, King Henry VIII, was a towering presence even when absent, his decisions echoing through every chamber of the palace. His voice carried power, but his affection was unpredictable. Elizabeth learned to watch more than she spoke, to read the mood of a room before stepping into it. Even as a child, she understood that silence could be a form of protection. The court moved like a restless sea, and she learned to float quietly upon it. Then, almost without explanation, her mother disappeared from her life. And Bullen, once radiant and admired, was suddenly erased from Elizabeth's world. The doors closed. The whispers grew louder. One day, her mother was there, warm and familiar. The next, she was gone. Her name spoken only in hushed tones, her presence replaced by absence. Elizabeth was too young to understand execution, but old enough to feel loss settle deep within her chest. Something precious had been taken, and no one explained why. In that silence, Elizabeth began to shape herself inwardly. She was declared illegitimate, stripped of the certainty that other children might take for granted. Titles changed. Servants came and went. Familiar faces vanished. Each shift taught her a lesson she would never forget. Nothing in this world was permanent. Trust had to be measured. Attachment carried risk. And so, she learned to rely on her own mind, her own careful observation, her own quiet resilience. Her education became her refuge. Books did not betray her. Languages did not whisper behind her back. Words, when written on a page, stayed where they were placed. Tutors recognized her sharp intelligence early, and Elizabeth absorbed knowledge with calm focus. Latin, Greek, French, Italian. Each language opened a new window, a new way of understanding power and people. History became a mirror, showing her the rise and fall of rulers who spoke too freely or trusted too deeply. Yet even learning was shaped by caution. Every lesson was watched, every success noted. Elizabeth learned not to shine too brightly. To stand out too much was to invite danger. And so, she practiced restraint. She answered questions carefully. She smiled softly. She listened far more than she spoke. This quiet discipline would one day define her rule, but for now, it simply kept her alive. The palace itself seemed to breathe around her, its long corridors holding memories of ambition and loss. At night, candlelight flickered against stone walls, and Elizabeth lay awake, sensing that her life was already being shaped by forces beyond her control. She did not yet know fear by name, but she felt it in the pauses between conversations, in the way adults lowered their voices when she entered the room. She understood that being seen could be dangerous, and being forgotten could be safer. As years passed, Elizabeth moved from household to household, never fully rooted, never entirely at ease. Each change reinforced the lesson that stability was an illusion. Yet instead of breaking her, this uncertainty sharpened her awareness. She learned patience. She learned timing. She learned that survival often depended not on strength, but on stillness. And so, as childhood slipped quietly into adolescence, Elizabeth became something rare in a world of loud ambition. She became watchful, thoughtful, calm. Beneath her composed exterior, a mind was forming that understood power not as force, but as endurance. The night gathered around her youth gently, and within that growing quiet, the future queen learned her most important lesson of all. That silence, when chosen wisely, could become a shield. And so, as the candlelight dimmed and the court settled into uneasy sleep, Elizabeth's journey moved quietly forward, shaped not by comfort, but by careful restraint, toward a destiny she could not yet see, but was already preparing to face. As Elizabeth grew older, the world around her did not soften. It sharpened. The court of England was a place where smiles could conceal danger, where loyalty shifted like weather, and where a single rumor could undo a life. She moved through these spaces with careful grace, learning the language of glances and pauses, understanding that what was left unsaid often mattered more than what was spoken aloud. Each day taught her that safety lived in awareness, and that attention, when managed wisely, could keep her hidden in plain sight. Her father's marriages came and went, each one leaving its mark on the household. New queens arrived with promise and ceremony, only to fade, sometimes quietly, sometimes violently. Elizabeth watched these women closely. She saw how favor could lift someone high, and how quickly it could vanish. Love, in this world, was tied to power, and power was never gentle. From these observations, she learned something vital. Attachment to any single person or position could be dangerous. Independence, even when lonely, offered protection. Despite her uncertain status, Elizabeth's education continued, almost defiantly. It was as if knowledge itself had become her guardian. Her tutors guided her through philosophy and scripture, through poetry and history, and she absorbed it all with steady calm. She did not rush. She did not boast. She let her learning grow quietly, like roots beneath the soil. While others competed for attention, Elizabeth prepared herself inwardly, trusting that understanding would one day serve her better than ambition. Faith, too, entered her life with complexity. England's religious landscape shifted under her feet, pulled back and forth between belief systems by royal decree. Elizabeth learned to listen rather than argue, to consider rather than condemn. She saw how deeply faith could divide people, and how easily conviction could turn to cruelty. These early impressions would shape her later choices, teaching her that peace often required balance, and that extremes rarely led to rest. Yet for all her discipline, fear never fully left her. It lingered like a quiet companion, reminding her of how fragile her position remained. She knew she was watched, evaluated, and judged not only for who she was, but for who she might become. Every letter she wrote, every word she spoke carried weight, and so she practiced control. Control of expression, control of emotion, control of silence. It was not coldness that guided her, but caution born of experience. The palace at Hatfield became a place of relative calm, though even there, peace was never complete. Elizabeth walked its gardens slowly, often alone, finding comfort in the rhythm of nature. The seasons moved forward without intrigue, without betrayal. Leaves fell and returned. Flowers bloomed and faded. In these quiet moments, she felt something close to safety. Nature did not question her legitimacy. It did not whisper about her future. It simply existed, steady and indifferent, offering her brief refuge from human uncertainty. At night, Elizabeth often reflected on her place in the world. She understood that she was different from other young women. Marriage was expected, obedience assumed, silence encouraged. Yet something within her resisted that narrow path. She felt a growing sense that her life might demand something else, something more solitary and more demanding. Still, she did not challenge fate openly. She waited. Waiting, she had learned, could be powerful. Her relationship with her siblings remained distant and careful. Love was tempered by politics, affection restrained by fear. Elizabeth knew that closeness could invite suspicion, and so she kept her emotions measured, her demeanor calm. This restraint was not weakness. It was armor shaped carefully over time, fitted precisely to the dangers she faced. As adolescence settled into young adulthood, Elizabeth stood at the edge of uncertainty once more. The future remained unclear, and danger had not passed. But she was no longer the vulnerable child she once was. She had learned to endure, to observe, and to adapt. The lessons of her early life had carved depth into her character, preparing her for trials still unseen. And so, as England's political winds shifted once again, and shadows lengthened across the court, Elizabeth moved forward quietly, her presence gentle but her resolve growing stronger beneath the surface. The night seemed to hold its breath around her, aware that this watchful young woman was becoming something more than a survivor. And with that quiet understanding, her story continued, carrying her toward a test that would demand everything she had learned, and more. The calm Elizabeth had learned to carry so carefully was soon tested by events beyond her control. As the court shifted once more, the fragile balance that had kept her safe began to tremble. Power changed hands, and with it came new fears, new loyalties, and new dangers. Elizabeth understood this pattern well by now. Change never arrived quietly. It crept in through whispers, through hurried footsteps in corridors, through faces that no longer met her gaze. When her half-brother Edward took the throne, England entered another uncertain season. Though young and fragile in body, Edward ruled in name, and those around him fought for influence. Elizabeth remained cautious, offering obedience without intimacy, presence without exposure. She knew better than to move too quickly or speak too boldly. Survival, she had learned, often depended on being underestimated. Edward's reign was brief, like a candle burning too fast. When it ended, the silence it left behind felt heavy and unresolved. England held its breath, unsure of what would come next. In that pause, Elizabeth felt the familiar tightening of uncertainty. She had lived through enough transitions to know that danger often followed moments like these. The question was never whether power would shift, but who would be caught beneath it. Mary, her older sister, soon claimed the crown. With her ascent came a return to old beliefs and old grudges. Elizabeth's faith, once a quiet and flexible thing, now became a source of suspicion. The court that had once watched her carefully now watched her closely. Every gesture was examined, every word weighed. Elizabeth moved through this new world with practiced restraint, her expression serene, her thoughts guarded. Accusations soon followed, as they often did in times of fear. Elizabeth was questioned, her loyalty doubted, her intentions twisted by those who saw her existence as a threat. For the first time since childhood, the walls closed in tightly around her. She was arrested and taken to the Tower of London, a place whose stones had witnessed ambition rise and fall, where echoes of the past whispered warnings to those who entered. Within those walls, Elizabeth faced her deepest fear. She knew the history. She knew what had happened to others who had passed through those gates. Each footstep echoed with memory. Each night stretched long and heavy. Yet even here she did not break. She did not plead. She did not rage. She remained still, drawing strength from the discipline she had cultivated since childhood. In the tower, time moved differently. Days blended into one another, marked only by light shifting across cold stone. Elizabeth prayed quietly, reflected deeply, and held fast to her composure. She understood that survival now depended on the same skill that had always protected her: restraint. To show fear would invite it. To show defiance would confirm suspicion. Silence, once again, became her refuge. Her letters from this period reveal a mind steady under pressure. She wrote carefully, respectfully, choosing each word with precision. Even as her fate hung uncertain, she demonstrated control and dignity. This calm was not born of certainty, but of acceptance. Elizabeth had learned long ago that some moments demanded patience rather than resistance. Eventually, the tension eased. She was released from the tower, though not fully free. House arrest followed, a quieter confinement, but confinement nonetheless. Yet Elizabeth emerged changed. Something within her had settled. She had faced the possibility of death and survived. The fear that once hovered at the edges of her life now felt familiar, almost manageable. This experience etched itself deep into her character. She had seen how quickly power could turn cruel, how belief could justify suffering, how silence could save a life. These lessons would not fade. They would shape every decision she made in the years to come. As she returned once more to waiting, Elizabeth did not rush toward hope. She allowed it to arrive slowly, carefully. She knew that patience had carried her this far, and impatience could undo everything. The court continued its restless movement, but Elizabeth remained calm within it, her presence steady, her future uncertain. And so, as the shadows of imprisonment receded and a fragile freedom returned, Elizabeth stood quietly at the edge of destiny. She had endured childhood loss, political suspicion, and the nearness of death itself. What awaited her next was something she could not yet control, but she was ready in the only way she knew how to be. The night deepened, and England waited. And somewhere within that waiting, the path toward a crown began to take shape, silent and inevitable. When Elizabeth finally stepped beyond the shadow of confinement, the air around her felt different. Freedom, though incomplete, carried a quiet weight of responsibility. She knew now, with absolute clarity, how close the world could come to ending without warning. That knowledge did not frighten her as it once might have. Instead, it settled within her like a steady flame, neither loud nor fragile, simply enduring. She returned to Hatfield with measured grace, her movements calm, her voice gentle. To those who watched her, she appeared unchanged. Yet beneath that composed surface, something essential had shifted. Elizabeth no longer lived with the illusion that innocence could protect her. She understood that survival required awareness, patience, and an unwavering command over herself. The girl shaped by silence was becoming a woman shaped by restraint. Life resumed its careful rhythm. Letters arrived. Messengers passed through. Rumors drifted like distant thunder, never fully breaking, never entirely fading. Elizabeth listened to them without reacting. She had learned that knowledge could be gathered quietly, and power accumulated slowly. Those around her often mistook her calm for passivity, not realizing that beneath her stillness, decisions were already forming. She devoted herself again to study, but now learning carried a deeper purpose. History was no longer just a subject. It was a warning. She studied the lives of rulers who had risen too quickly, spoken too boldly, trusted too freely. Their downfalls whispered lessons she absorbed carefully. She was preparing, though she never spoke of it aloud, for a future that might demand everything she had learned. Elizabeth's faith continued to remain private, flexible, inward. She understood how dangerous certainty could be in a divided world. Rather than declare herself loudly, she chose balance. This was not indecision. It was strategy shaped by experience. She had seen what rigid belief could cost, and she resolved not to let conviction harden into cruelty. As time passed, Mary's reign grew heavier, burdened by unrest and illness. The court felt tense, brittle, as if waiting for something it could not name. Elizabeth sensed the shift long before it was spoken. The world had taught her to feel change before it arrived. She did not celebrate the possibility. She did not rush toward it. She waited, as she always had, allowing events to move toward her rather than reaching out to seize them. When news finally came that Mary's health was failing, it arrived quietly, without ceremony. Elizabeth received it with calm acceptance. There was no triumph in her expression, no visible anticipation. She understood the cost of crowns. She had watched it claim lives, strain faith, and isolate those who wore it. Power, she knew, was never free. In the quiet moments that followed, Elizabeth walked the familiar paths of Hatfield's grounds, her steps slow, deliberate. The air felt heavy with possibility. Each breath seemed to carry the weight of England's future. She did not pray for victory. She prayed for wisdom, for patience, for the strength to endure what lay ahead. Those around her began to look at her differently now. The watchful eyes held expectation instead of suspicion. The silence that once protected her now surrounded her like a gathering tide. Elizabeth met it without fear. She had spent her life preparing for this moment, though she had never named it. And so, as the last days of Mary's reign approached, Elizabeth stood quietly at the threshold of destiny. She was no longer merely surviving. She was becoming. The lessons of her childhood, the discipline of silence, the endurance of waiting, all converged here, shaping a future that would soon demand her presence fully. The night seemed to pause, as if holding its breath. England waited, and Elizabeth, calm and composed, waited too, ready to step forward when the moment finally arrived. The moment arrived not with thunder, but with stillness. A quiet announcement, carried by careful voices, confirmed what many had already sensed. Mary was gone. The crown, heavy with history and consequence, now turned toward Elizabeth. There were no cheers in that first breath of knowledge, no outward display of triumph. Elizabeth received the news seated beneath an old oak at Hatfield, her hands resting calmly in her lap, her expression composed. For a long moment, she said nothing at all. Those who watched later remembered the silence more than the words. It was the silence of understanding. Elizabeth knew that her life, as it had been, was ending. In its place rose something larger, lonelier, and infinitely more demanding. She stood slowly, grounding herself in the earth beneath her feet, and spoke with measured calm. The crown had found her, not because she had reached for it, but because she had endured. That night she did not sleep easily. The familiar weight of solitude pressed closer, heavier now than ever before. She thought of her mother, lost to history's cruelty. She thought of the tower's cold walls, of whispered accusations, of years spent waiting without certainty. All of it had led here, to this quiet turning point where the past released its hold and the future stepped forward. Elizabeth understood something rare in rulers even before she wore the crown. Power was not a reward. It was a burden carried alone. It demanded sacrifice, restraint, and the willingness to place duty above desire. As dawn approached, she prepared herself not with celebration, but with resolve. The girl shaped by silence was ready to become a queen shaped by control. When she traveled toward London, the roads felt different beneath her. Crowds gathered, faces filled with hope, curiosity, and longing. Elizabeth acknowledged them with gentle grace, her presence calm, reassuring. She offered no grand promises, no dramatic declarations. Instead, she offered steadiness. In a world exhausted by fear and division, her composure itself became a comfort. Inside, however, the weight pressed deeper. She knew that every choice would now echo far beyond her own life. Every word would be remembered, every silence interpreted. Yet she did not resist this knowledge. She accepted it fully, allowing it to settle into her bones. She had lived long enough under observation to understand its demands. As the coronation approached, Elizabeth withdrew inwardly, reflecting on the path behind her. Childhood loss had taught her caution. Imprisonment had taught her endurance. Waiting had taught her patience. These were not weaknesses. They were the quiet tools of survival in a dangerous world. And now, they would become the foundation of her reign. On the eve of her coronation, Elizabeth stood alone for a moment, listening to the distant sounds of a city preparing for ceremony. The night air carried both anticipation and unease. She breathed slowly, grounding herself in stillness, allowing fear to pass without taking hold. She knew the road ahead would be long, filled with trials unseen, but she also knew herself now more fully than ever before. And so, as England prepared to welcome a new queen, Elizabeth crossed the final threshold of her past. The watchful child, the cautious prisoner, the patient survivor all remained within her, shaping the ruler she was about to become. The night closed gently around this turning point, not as an ending, but as a quiet beginning. And with that, the first chapter of her life drew to a close, leaving behind a sense of calm before the storm, and carrying us softly toward the reign that would define her name and haunt history long after her final breath. Elizabeth's coronation dawned beneath a sky that felt wide and watchful, as if England itself were pausing to see what kind of ruler would now rise. The city stirred slowly, bells ringing not in celebration alone, but in cautious hope. For years, the kingdom had known turbulence. Faith turned against faith, loyalty tested again and again. Now, a young queen moved forward through narrow streets, her presence calm, her expression steady, carrying a future that many longed for, yet few fully trusted. As the crown was placed upon her head, Elizabeth did not smile broadly. She did not lift her chin in triumph. Instead, she accepted the weight with quiet seriousness. She understood that this moment was not about her alone. It belonged to the people who watched her, to the land that had endured so much change, and to the fragile peace that might yet be shaped by patience rather than force. power settled onto her shoulders like a heavy cloak, warm in places, suffocating in others. From the very beginning, Elizabeth chose to listen. The court gathered around her, full of voices eager to advise, persuade, and influence. Some spoke with loyalty, others with ambition disguised as wisdom. Elizabeth heard them all, rarely interrupting, absorbing not only their words but their intentions. Silence, once her shield, now became her method. In listening, she learned where danger slept and where trust might cautiously be placed. England's wounds were deep. Years of religious conflict had left scars that could not be healed with declarations alone. Elizabeth sensed that certainty would only sharpen division, and so she chose balance. She did not demand uniform belief. She asked for outward peace. This decision, quiet yet bold, unsettled those who wanted clarity through control. But Elizabeth had learned that peace often grew not from force, but from restraint. Her days filled quickly with responsibility. Letters arrived from foreign courts, each one measured and watchful, testing the strength of England's new ruler. Elizabeth answered them carefully, her words precise, her tone calm. She understood that diplomacy was not a contest of dominance, but a careful dance of respect and patience. Each response was crafted not to impress, but to endure. At night, when the court finally quieted, Elizabeth allowed herself moments of reflection. The crown, now removed, left a faint pressure that lingered in her thoughts. She was queen, yet she was also alone. There were no equals to confide in freely, no safe spaces untouched by politics. This solitude was not new to her. It was familiar, almost comforting. She had been preparing for it her entire life. She walked often, slowly, through palace corridors once filled with others who had worn power briefly and badly. Their absence spoke louder than their memory. Elizabeth listened to those echoes, not with fear, but with respect. They reminded her that a reign could be undone as easily as it was begun. And so, as her rule took its first careful steps, Elizabeth moved neither too fast nor too slow. She chose steadiness over spectacle, patience over passion. The nation watched closely, uncertain yet hopeful, sensing that something quieter, something more enduring, might be taking shape. As the night settled over her early reign, Elizabeth stood at a window, looking out over a city resting uneasily beneath her rule. The future remained uncertain, but for the first time, it was hers to shape. And with calm resolve, she prepared to walk forward into it, one careful choice at a time. As the early weeks of Elizabeth's reign unfolded, the rhythm of power revealed itself slowly, like a tide that could not be rushed. Each morning arrived with petitions, concerns, and quiet urgencies, and each evening ended with questions that refused easy answers. Elizabeth learned quickly that ruling was not a series of grand moments, but a continuous act of attention. The crown did not demand brilliance every day. It demanded steadiness again and again. The question of marriage hovered constantly, spoken aloud by advisors and whispered in corridors. To many, it seemed obvious that a queen should secure her rule through a husband, preferably one powerful enough to protect the realm. Elizabeth listened to these suggestions with calm interest, yet she felt the danger beneath them. Marriage, she understood, was never just personal. It was political, binding her body and authority to another will. She had seen too much of how power shifted when shared unwillingly. Rather than dismiss the idea, Elizabeth allowed it to remain unresolved. Suitors came from distant courts, each offering alliance, security, and influence. Elizabeth responded with grace and patience, never committing, never refusing outright. In this space of waiting, she preserved her independence. Time became her ally. Each delayed decision strengthened her position, allowing England to grow accustomed to a queen who ruled alone. Religion remained a quiet storm beneath the surface of daily governance. Elizabeth approached it carefully, like a narrow bridge crossed at dusk. She restored certain traditions while allowing others to remain, crafting a path that avoided extremes. This middle way did not satisfy everyone, but it softened the sharpest edges of division. Elizabeth understood that belief, when forced, hardened into resistance. Peace, she believed, required room to breathe. Foreign eyes watched her closely. Spain, France, and other powers measured her youth and gender against their own ambitions. Elizabeth answered their curiosity not with bravado, but with dignity. Her letters were composed with balance, her tone neither submissive nor aggressive. She did not seek to intimidate, she sought to endure. In doing so, she slowly reshaped how England was perceived, not as a kingdom ruled by weakness, but by quiet resolve. Yet beneath this calm exterior, Elizabeth felt the weight of isolation deepen. Every decision created distance between herself and those around her. Trust had limits now. Even kindness carried risk. She learned to find comfort in routine, in the steady order of her days. Walking, reading, listening. These moments of stillness allowed her to remain grounded in a world that never stopped moving. At night, as the palace settled into silence, Elizabeth reflected on the path she had chosen. She knew that patience could be mistaken for indecision, restraint for fear, but she also knew her own strength. She had survived far worse than criticism. The dangers of her youth had taught her that time revealed truth more clearly than haste ever could. As months passed, England began to adjust to her rule. The tension did not vanish, but it softened. People listened. They waited. Elizabeth's calm became a quiet reassurance, a promise not spoken aloud, but felt in the rhythm of daily life. Her presence, steady and unyielding, offered something rare in a restless age. And so, as the night closed gently around her second season as queen, Elizabeth remained awake in thought, aware that the greatest tests had not yet arrived. The world beyond England's shores was shifting. Threats were forming, alliances bending. The calm she had cultivated would soon be tested by forces louder and darker than whispers. For now, she rested within the silence she knew so well, gathering strength without display, preparing for storms still unseen, trusting that patience, once again, would guide her forward. As the years moved quietly forward, the shape of Elizabeth's reign began to settle into something recognizable, though never entirely predictable. The early uncertainty did not vanish, but it transformed, becoming a constant undercurrent rather than a breaking wave. Elizabeth learned to live within this tension, to carry it lightly without ignoring its presence. Stability, she knew, was not the absence of threat, but the ability to endure it without fracture. Her court grew more structured, yet remained carefully balanced. Advisors came and went, some rising through loyalty and wisdom, others falling through ambition or misjudgment. Elizabeth watched these shifts closely, rarely reacting in the moment. She preferred to observe patterns over time, allowing truth to reveal itself through repetition. When she acted, it was often with surprising decisiveness, her restraint giving way to clarity only when necessary. The question of her unmarried state continued to define public perception. Songs praised her independence, while critics questioned her choices. Elizabeth allowed both to exist. She understood the power of image and used it carefully, shaping herself into something larger than an individual woman. The idea of the Virgin Queen began to take form, not as a denial of humanity, but as a symbol of dedication. Her body, she suggested without ever declaring, belonged to the realm itself. Yet this transformation came at a cost. Loneliness pressed deeper as the years passed. The boundaries she maintained for safety also kept others at a distance. Even trusted companions could not fully cross the line between subject and sovereign. Elizabeth accepted this quietly. She had long known that intimacy and power rarely coexisted peacefully. Beyond the court, England changed as well. Trade expanded. Cities grew louder and more crowded. New ideas drifted in with merchants and travelers, carrying both promise and uncertainty. Elizabeth encouraged growth without surrendering control, allowing innovation while guarding against chaos. She sensed that the world was moving faster now, and that survival depended on flexibility as much as strength. Religious tension, though softened, never fully disappeared. Elizabeth remained firm in her insistence on outward conformity and inward freedom. This balance angered extremes on both sides, yet it preserved a fragile peace. She understood that lasting calm often disappointed those who sought purity or dominance. Her goal was not to satisfy but to sustain. In private moments, Elizabeth sometimes allowed herself reflection tinged with melancholy. She remembered childhood rooms now long abandoned, faces lost to time, paths not taken. These thoughts did not weaken her. They grounded her, reminding her that sacrifice had shaped her path. She had chosen duty, fully and without apology. As the court settled into evening, Elizabeth often lingered by candlelight, reviewing letters, considering news from abroad. Each message carried the weight of possibility. Alliances could shift, wars could rise. She knew that peace was never permanent, only carefully maintained. And so, as the night wrapped itself around the steady pulse of her reign, Elizabeth remained watchful. The calm she had built was real, but delicate. Beyond England's borders, forces gathered, testing her patience and resolve. The quiet strength she had cultivated would soon be called upon in ways she could not yet foresee. For now, she breathed within the stillness, aware that every season of peace carries within it the seeds of challenge, and that endurance, once again, would be her greatest ally. As Elizabeth's reign stretched onward, the silence she had learned to trust began to fill with distant rumblings. They arrived first as letters sealed with careful courtesy, then as rumors carried by merchants and diplomats who spoke softly but with urgency in their eyes. Beyond England's shores, powers were shifting. Faith hardened into certainty elsewhere, and certainty into threat. Elizabeth listened to these signs the way she always had, without alarm, without denial, allowing them to settle into understanding. Spain loomed largest in these quiet calculations. Its king ruled a vast empire with confidence sharpened by belief, and his gaze often turned toward England with measured interest. Elizabeth understood what that interest carried beneath it. Religion, pride, and power were tightly woven there, and England's refusal to bend fully in any one direction made it a point of tension. Yet Elizabeth did not rush toward confrontation. She responded with diplomacy, with careful words that offered respect without surrender. Court concern grew louder. Advisors urged preparation, warning that patience might be mistaken for weakness. Elizabeth heard them, acknowledged their fears, and then chose her own pace. She had lived long enough to know that fear often pushed people toward mistakes. She would not be moved by urgency alone. Strength, she believed, came from knowing when to wait and when to act. Privately, the weight of leadership pressed more heavily than before. Decisions now carried the possibility of war, of loss beyond personal consequence. Elizabeth felt this responsibility deeply, though she rarely showed it. In quiet moments, she walked alone, allowing the stillness to steady her thoughts. The crown was no longer new. It had settled into her life fully, shaping her days and nights alike. She invested in England's defenses with care rather than spectacle. Ships were strengthened, ports watched more closely, alliances were considered thoughtfully, never rushed. Elizabeth understood that preparation did not require announcement. Readiness, when done quietly, could be far more effective than display. Her public image continued to evolve alongside these efforts. Portraits presented her as timeless, unchanging, almost removed from ordinary life. This was not vanity alone. It was protection. By becoming a symbol, Elizabeth placed distance between herself and attack. The woman faded into the idea, and the idea became difficult to challenge directly. Yet within that symbol lived a human heart, one that felt the strain of constant vigilance. There were nights when sleep came slowly, when the future pressed close and heavy. In those moments, Elizabeth returned to the habits that had always sustained her. Reading, reflection, silence. These were the tools that had carried her through childhood loss and imprisonment, and they continued to serve her now. As tensions abroad deepened, England's people sensed the shift. Anxiety moved through the streets quietly, like a change in weather felt before clouds appeared. Elizabeth responded not with dramatic speeches, but with steadiness. Her presence remained calm. Her voice remained measured. This consistency became its own reassurance. And so, As the night deepened over a kingdom standing at the edge of uncertainty, Elizabeth held her course. She did not deny the storm gathering beyond the horizon. She prepared for it patiently, trusting that when the moment arrived, she would meet it not with fear, but with the same quiet resolve that had shaped her life from the very beginning. Time moved forward with the slow certainty of a tide, and with it came a deeper understanding of what Elizabeth's reign would demand. The distant rumblings she had sensed now felt closer, more defined. Spain's presence pressed against England like a shadow at dusk, long and inescapable. Yet Elizabeth remained composed, her outward calm unchanged, even as the stakes grew heavier with each passing season. Within the court, conversations grew quieter but more urgent. Maps were studied, messages decoded. Every movement across the sea was noted, every alliance weighed with care. Elizabeth listened as she always had, letting others speak fully before offering her own thoughts. When she did speak, her words were few, deliberate, and often final. The patience of her earlier years had not faded. It had matured into confidence. She understood now that leadership required not only foresight, but trust in one's own judgment. There were moments when advice conflicted, when fear tugged against reason. In those moments, Elizabeth turned inward. She remembered the lessons of her youth, the cost of haste, the danger of certainty. Waiting, when guided by understanding, could be an act of strength. Despite the growing tension, Elizabeth continued to nurture the image of calm stability. Public appearances were measured and reassuring. She spoke of unity, of endurance, of a shared future shaped by restraint rather than panic. Her presence carried a quiet authority that soothed as much as it commanded. The people did not see the weight she carried alone. They saw only steadiness, and in that steadiness, they found rest. In private, Elizabeth acknowledged the fear she would never fully escape. It lived beside her now, no longer sharp, but constant. She did not resent it. Fear, she had learned, could sharpen awareness if not allowed to rule. She let it exist without letting it guide her hand. The sea, once a distant boundary, now felt central to England's fate. Ships became symbols of survival, of movement and defense. Elizabeth invested in them thoughtfully, understanding that the future might be decided not in grand halls, but on open water beneath uncertain skies. Preparation continued quietly, without fanfare, without boasting. As months turned into years, the sense of approaching confrontation settled into the background of daily life. It did not dominate every moment, but it was never absent. Elizabeth lived within this awareness with grace, refusing to let it harden her or rush her. She trusted that clarity would arrive when it was needed. Late at night, when the palace slept, Elizabeth sometimes stood at a window, gazing toward the unseen sea. The darkness beyond was vast, unknowable. She did not try to imagine every outcome. Instead, she breathed slowly, grounding herself in the present. Whatever came, she would meet it as she had met everything else in her life, with patience, restraint, and quiet resolve. And so, as the second chapter of her reign drew gently toward its close, England stood poised between peace and storm. Elizabeth, calm at the center of it all, remained watchful, prepared to face whatever dawn might bring. The night held its breath once more, and beyond it, history waited to turn. Chapter 3, Part 1. The storm Elizabeth had sensed for so long did not arrive suddenly. It gathered slowly, almost politely, carried on tides and treaties, on prayers spoken with certainty and threats hidden behind courtesy. Europe was restless, and faith had hardened into something unyielding. Across the sea, Spain watched England not as a neighbor, but as a challenge that refused to be resolved quietly. Elizabeth felt this pressure long before it became visible to others. She had learned to recognize the subtle signs, the tightening of language in letters, the pauses where reassurance once lived. Yet she did not allow this awareness to disturb her composure. Fear, when allowed to surface openly, could weaken resolve. And Elizabeth had built her life on the careful management of inner storms. Court tension deepened. Advisors spoke more frequently of invasion, of the need for readiness. Elizabeth listened, her expression calm, her presence steady. She did not dismiss their concerns, nor did she allow urgency to overpower judgment. She knew that preparation demanded clarity, not panic. Each decision now carried the weight of countless lives, and she bore that responsibility quietly. Religion lay at the heart of the growing conflict. To Spain, England's path was unacceptable, its balance seen as defiance. Elizabeth understood this clearly. She also understood that retreat was no longer an option. Yet she resisted framing the moment as destiny or drama. War, she believed, should never be romanticized. It was disruption, loss, and irreversible change. Privately, Elizabeth reflected on how far she had come. The child shaped by silence, the young woman hardened by suspicion, the queen forged through patience. All of them lived within her still. Each version had prepared her for this moment. She did not need to become someone new. She needed only to remain herself. England's defenses continued to strengthen quietly. Ships were outfitted, crews trained, ports watched with renewed focus. These efforts were steady rather than spectacular. Elizabeth did not seek to impress history. She sought to survive it. Readiness, she knew, did not require announcement. It required persistence. The people of England began to feel the shift more clearly now. Conversations lingered longer in marketplaces. Eyes turned toward the sea. Yet there was no panic. Elizabeth's calm had become a shared rhythm, guiding the nation through uncertainty without demanding fear. Her steadiness allowed others to remain steady too. At night, Elizabeth returned to her familiar solitude. Sleep came and went, sometimes light, sometimes elusive. In wakeful moments, she allowed herself honesty. She knew the coming conflict would test everything she had built. It would demand courage not only from soldiers, but from a queen who must remain calm while the world shook around her. She did not pray for victory alone. She prayed for endurance, for clarity, for the strength to act without cruelty and to lead without losing herself. These quiet prayers carried no ceremony. They were whispered into stillness, meant only for the night. And so, as the horizon darkened and the distant storm drew closer, Elizabeth stood at the center of a nation holding its breath. The calm before the breaking wave was not empty. It was filled with preparation, resolve, and the quiet courage of a woman who had learned, long ago, how to stand steady when the world refused to be gentle. As the threat grew clearer, Elizabeth felt time tighten around her like a narrowing circle. Messages arrived more frequently now, stripped of pleasantries, heavy with implication. Spain's intentions no longer lived only in suggestion. They moved closer to action, carried on ships gathering beyond the horizon, on confidence born of size and certainty. England was smaller, quieter, and painfully aware of its limits. Elizabeth did not hide from this knowledge. She studied it carefully, letting fear pass through her without taking root. Panic would have been easier, perhaps even expected, but she had never lived her life according to expectation. Instead, she leaned deeper into the discipline that had shaped her since childhood. Calm was not the absence of danger. It was the refusal to let danger decide her thoughts. She met with her advisors more often now, the conversations longer, the silences heavier. Maps were unrolled beneath candlelight, coastlines traced by thoughtful fingers. Each harbor, each narrow channel, carried significance. Elizabeth listened intently, asking questions that revealed not anxiety, but understanding. She did not pretend to know everything. She sought clarity, not control. There were voices that urged boldness, dramatic action meant to send a message. Elizabeth resisted these impulses gently but firmly. She understood that loud gestures often revealed insecurity. Strength, she believed, could speak softly and still be heard. England would prepare, but it would not posture. Readiness would be its answer, not bravado. In private, Elizabeth confronted the loneliness of command more deeply than ever before. The responsibility she carried could not be shared, not truly. Even trusted counsel ended where her own judgment began. She accepted this solitude with quiet resolve. It was the price of authority, one she had long known she would have to pay. The people sensed the narrowing of time as well. Fishermen spoke of unfamiliar sails glimpsed far out at sea. Bells seemed to linger longer in the air. Yet life continued. Markets opened. Children laughed. Elizabeth took comfort in this persistence. It reminded her of what she was protecting, of why patience and preparation mattered more than fear. One evening, as twilight softened the sky, Elizabeth stood before a gathering of soldiers and sailors. She spoke to them without flourish, her voice steady, her words measured. She did not promise ease or glory. She acknowledged danger honestly, and in doing so, offered something stronger than reassurance. She offered trust. Trust in their courage. Trust in their endurance. Trust in the shared resolve of a nation that had learned, through hardship, how to stand together. That night, alone once more, Elizabeth allowed herself a moment of stillness. She thought of the years behind her, of how often she had waited, watched, and endured. This too was waiting, though of a different kind. The moment of action had not yet arrived, but it was no longer distant. She breathed slowly, grounding herself in the present. Whatever dawn brought, she would meet it without surrendering to fear. She had been preparing for this all her life, not through force, but through patience shaped by survival. And so, as the night deepened and the sea lay dark and watchful beyond the walls, Elizabeth remained awake in quiet resolve, knowing that the test she had long anticipated was drawing near, and that soon the silence would break. The days that followed unfolded like a long, unbroken breath. The sea carried both danger and hope, its moods shifting with the wind. Reports arrived slowly, shaped by distance and uncertainty, each one adding another layer to a story still being written. Elizabeth listened to them all with the same measured calm, aware that victory and loss often shared the same fragile space. England's ships moved with determination rather than grandeur. They did not seek overwhelming force. They sought endurance. The weather itself seemed to take part, winds changing, storms rising and fading as if nature were testing resolve on both sides. Elizabeth understood this not as fate, but as reminder. Control was always partial. Adaptation mattered more. As the conflict stretched on, the weight of leadership deepened. Elizabeth did not allow herself the comfort of certainty. She stayed alert, responsive, grounded. When news of success reached her, she accepted it without indulgence. When setbacks followed, she met them without despair. Balance, she knew, preserved clarity. The people watched her closely. In moments of tension, they looked to her face, her posture, her voice. She gave them steadiness, not because she felt none of the fear they felt, but because she had learned how to carry it without letting it spill outward. This quiet mastery became her greatest gift to the nation. There were moments late at night when exhaustion brushed close. Elizabeth allowed herself brief stillness, nothing more. She had learned long ago that rest, even in small measure, was not weakness. It was preservation. The long years of waiting had prepared her for endurance far more than any moment of drama ever could. Gradually, the shape of the struggle shifted. The threat that had loomed so large began to thin, not through a single decisive blow, but through persistence. The fleet that had once pressed forward with confidence now faltered, worn by distance, weather, and resistance. Elizabeth watched this change without triumph. Relief came quietly, settling in her chest without celebration. When confirmation arrived that the immediate danger had passed, Elizabeth received it in silence. She closed her eyes briefly, not in victory, but in gratitude. Lives had been spared. The land endured. That was enough. Publicly, she addressed the nation with humility rather than pride. She spoke of shared effort, of courage found in unity, of endurance rewarded through patience. She did not claim the moment as her own. She allowed it to belong to England itself. In private, Elizabeth reflected on the cost that would never be fully known. Those lost at sea. Families changed forever. Victory did not erase sacrifice. It lived alongside it, inseparable. She carried this understanding with care, allowing it to deepen rather than harden her. As the sea grew quieter and the nights softened once more, Elizabeth returned to the stillness that had shaped her life. The storm had passed, but its echo remained. She knew that peace was never permanent, only renewed through vigilance and restraint. And so, as the third chapter of her reign drew gently toward its close, Elizabeth stood in the calm that followed survival. She had faced the greatest threat of her time and remained herself throughout. The quiet queen had proven that strength need not shout to endure. In the quiet that followed the storm, England seemed to exhale for the first time in many years. The sea, once watched with fear, returned to its familiar rhythm, carrying trade and travel instead of threat. Bells rang again, not in alarm, but in measured relief. Elizabeth allowed the moment to pass without ceremony. She understood that peace, like danger, could not be taken for granted. It had to be held gently, protected without complacency. The court slowly settled into a calmer pace, though the memory of what had nearly come to pass lingered in every conversation. Elizabeth noticed how people spoke more softly now, how gratitude replaced urgency in their voices. She accepted their praise with grace, never encouraging excess. To her, survival had not been a triumph of ego, but a confirmation of patience. What had carried them through was not boldness, but restraint sustained over time. Privately, Elizabeth felt the weariness she had long postponed. It arrived not as collapse, but as a deep, quiet fatigue. She allowed herself moments of rest, brief and deliberate. Walking alone through familiar halls, she felt the echo of her own footsteps and thought of how many years those halls had shaped her. From frightened child to watchful queen, each stage had demanded endurance, and she had answered with stillness. She reflected often on the nature of power after the crisis had passed. Victory had strengthened her authority, but it had also clarified its limits. She knew now, more than ever, that command did not grant control over fate. It only granted responsibility. This understanding deepened her humility, anchoring her resolve against arrogance. Elizabeth also felt a subtle shift within herself. The fear that had once lived at the edges of her life had softened. It did not disappear, but it no longer dominated her thoughts. She had faced the greatest test of her reign and remained steady. This knowledge settled quietly, becoming confidence without noise. The image of the Virgin Queen grew stronger in the public mind, now almost mythic. Elizabeth accepted this transformation carefully. She understood that symbols could protect as much as they could imprison. By allowing herself to become an idea, she preserved the distance that safety required, even as it deepened her solitude. As seasons turned, England moved forward changed but intact. Elizabeth guided it gently, mindful of the scars left behind. She encouraged rebuilding, stability, and patience, knowing that healing followed survival slowly, not all at once. At night, she sometimes returned in thought to the sea, to the long days of waiting, to the calm she had chosen again and again. Those moments had defined her not because they were dramatic, but because they demanded restraint. In that restraint, she had found her strength. And so, as the third chapter of her life settled into memory, Elizabeth stood quietly at its edge, aware that history would remember the storm, but that her true achievement lay in the stillness that endured through it. Ahead, new challenges waited, different in shape but no less demanding. The night remained gentle, and Elizabeth, steady as ever, moved forward once more. With the storm now resting quietly behind her, Elizabeth turned toward a different kind of challenge, one that did not arrive on ships or announce itself with drums. It moved slowly, through letters, whispers, glances across long tables. Peace, she had learned, carried its own dangers. It softened vigilance. It invited assumption. And so she met it with the same careful attention she had once given to war. England was breathing again, but it was not the same England that had waited for invasion. The nation felt older somehow, more aware of its place in the world. Trade routes stretched farther. Ideas traveled faster than ever before. Across the sea, empires rose and shifted, and Elizabeth watched them with quiet focus. She understood that isolation was no longer possible. The world had grown smaller, and England stood firmly within it. Court, the rhythms changed. Urgency gave way to ambition. Those who had stood united against an outside threat now returned to private desires. Elizabeth observed this without judgment. Human nature, she knew, always returned to itself. Her task was not to eliminate ambition, but to guide it, soften its edges, and prevent it from sharpening into danger. Religion remained the most delicate balance of all. Though open conflict had quieted, belief still divided hearts. Elizabeth continued her careful path, refusing to harden the nation into a single shape. She understood that force created obedience, not peace. What endured was patience. What lasted was tolerance practiced quietly, without applause. In moments of solitude, Elizabeth reflected on how deeply the years had shaped her. She had grown into power slowly, learning not to rush decisions, not to trust sudden certainty. Time had been her greatest teacher. It had taught her when to speak, and more importantly, when to remain silent. Silence, she had discovered, often carried more authority than command. Her image had become something almost unreal to her people. She saw it reflected in paintings, in poems, in the way others lowered their voices in her presence. The Virgin Queen was no longer simply a title. It was a shield, a myth carefully maintained. Elizabeth wore it deliberately, knowing it protected both her body and her rule. Yet beneath it, she remained deeply human, carrying the quiet weight of isolation. Marriage proposals still arrived, though they now felt ceremonial, echoes of a path she had long closed. Elizabeth considered them politely, thoughtfully, always aware of what each alliance would cost. To marry was to divide loyalty. To remain alone was to remain whole. She had chosen wholeness even when it asked for sacrifice. As the years passed, Elizabeth's leadership grew increasingly subtle. She ruled not through force, but through presence. Meetings ended differently when she spoke last. Arguments softened when she listened without interruption. She allowed others to believe decisions were shared, even when the direction had been hers from the beginning. This was not deception. It was stewardship. At night, when the court finally slept, Elizabeth often walked alone through familiar corridors. Candlelight traced the stone walls, revealing marks left by generations before her. She felt their presence, the kings and queens who had ruled loudly and fallen quickly. She had learned from them without repeating them. Survival, she knew, was its own form of legacy. The world beyond England continued to shift. New lands were spoken of with curiosity and hunger. Exploration promised wealth and danger in equal measure. Elizabeth listened carefully, encouraging ambition while guarding against recklessness. Expansion required vision, but vision without restraint had destroyed many before her. She would not let England move faster than it could endure. Still, a quiet loneliness threaded through her nights. The cost of her crown was not bloodshed now, but distance. She belonged to everyone and fully to no one. Elizabeth accepted this truth without bitterness. She had made her choice consciously, and she would honor it fully. As the fourth chapter of her life unfolded, it did so without spectacle. No storms, no battles, only the steady work of holding a nation together in calm. This, Elizabeth knew, would be her true test. Not how she survived danger, but how she preserved peace. And so, as the night deepened and England rested beneath her quiet watch, Elizabeth moved forward once more, aware that the softest moments often demanded the greatest strength.